Some memories stick with you not because they make sense, but because they defy every logical explanation you've ever tried to construct. I used to pride myself on being level-headed. I wasn't the kind of person to jump to paranormal conclusions at the slightest creak in the floorboards. But whatever unfolded on that particular night permanently shattered my view of reality. Back then, I was seeing a guy named Evan. His family owned an immense plot of land tucked miles away from civilization, far beyond city limits. Surrounded by sprawling fields and dense clusters of trees, their house sat in total isolation, with no neighbors in sight and no passing traffic once you pulled past the main gate. When Evan's parents left town for a few days, he asked me to stay over for Saturday night. Jokingly, I mentioned I wasn't sure I could handle the sheer emptiness of such a remote place. He just laughed it off, assuring me there was zero to worry about. For the first several hours, he was completely right. We spent the evening cooking together, sharing a bottle of wine and losing track of time over card games. Before dozing off on the living room couch past midnight, I can't say how long we had been asleep before something violently jarred me awake. At first, I assumed I was caught in the middle of a bizarre nightmare. Then the entire structure of the house began to tremor. A deep, low-frequency roar reverberated right through the walls. It wasn't an explosion, nor was it distant thunder. It carried the chilling resonance of a gigantic foghorn, magnified to a deafening, chest-compressing scale. Window panes vibrated. Kitchenware rattled violently inside the cupboards. I could physically feel the shock wave pulsing through the couch. Evan was already on his feet the second our eyes snapped open. "What was that?" I managed to whisper. He didn't reply, simply staring out toward the massive window overlooking the backfield. Total emptiness. No headlights, no stray animals, no movement at all. Just a blanket of pitch-black wilderness. I stood beside him, desperately bargaining with myself, trying to invent any plausible excuse. Maybe some heavy agricultural equipment broke down nearby. Maybe it was just a freak acoustic echo. Then the backyard erupted into light. A blinding white flash detonated somewhere deep within the tree line, illuminating the entire living room in a harsh, ghostly glare for a split second. We both recoiled in shock. Without a word, Evan rushed to kill the television and flick off the remaining lights, muttering that we needed total darkness inside to see into the yard. I hated the idea, but I stayed glued to his side as we crept toward the kitchen. Minutes ticked by in suffocating silence as we stared into the blackness. Suddenly, the motion sensor floodlight mounted over the back patio flickered to life. Evan stiffened instantly. "That shouldn't be triggering," he murmured, edging closer to the glass. When I asked why, his voice dropped to a nervous whisper. "It's motion activated, and it doesn't pick up small wildlife." Before I could process his warning, a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't footsteps, and it wasn't speech. It was a cluster of overlapping voices whispering simultaneously, warped and distorted as if someone were speaking from deep underwater miles away. I locked eyes with Evan. "Someone is out there." He didn't argue. Moments later, two tall silhouettes drifted past the side window. They didn't walk with a normal human cadence. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, almost sliding sideways through the dark. Evan snatched his phone to dial emergency services, but his face fell as he stared at the display. No service. My hands shook as I checked mine, completely dead. In a place where we'd always had full bars, it defied all reason. Panic spiked when the handle of the side door rattled. Once, twice, aggressively. Someone was trying to force it open, a door I had personally watched Evan lock before we went to bed. Terrified, I screamed out that we knew they were outside. The rattling halted instantly. Heavy, suffocating silence hung in the air for a few seconds before the wet, distorted whispering resumed, sounding much closer this time. Evan bluffed loudly, shouting that the police were already en route, even though our phones remained lifeless blocks of glass. Right then, the deafening foghorn sound tore through the night once more. The house shook with such violence that I dropped to my knees, slapping my hands over my ears. The low, droning roar lasted an eternity before snapping shut into dead silence. And just like that, the nightmare shifted gears. The shadows were gone. Another brilliant flash lit up the yard, and the exact second it faded, our phones came back to life, buzzing frantically with a flood of delayed notifications. Then both the front door and the side door swung wide open on their own. I let out a piercing shriek as Evan bolted across the room to slam and lock both entrances. When we finally got a signal through to the authorities, officers arrived to sweep the property. They checked every entry point and combed the yard with flashlights, looking thoroughly bewildered by our frantic explanation. One officer kept pressing us on which way the intruders could have fled. We couldn't give him an answer. But the most disturbing detail came when they checked the ground. It had rained earlier that evening, leaving a thick layer of soft mud all around the perimeter of the house. If two people had been pacing outside our windows and trying our doors, they should have left deep, unmistakable footprints. There were none. Not a single track marred the mud. No forced locks, no physical traces whatsoever. Dismissing it as an unfounded scare, the officers eventually left. Evan and I spent the remainder of the night sitting side by side in the dark living room until dawn broke. Months later, when I brought it up, Evan claimed nothing like that had ever happened to him or his family before or since. I've spent years trying to rationalize every piece of it. Maybe it was trespassers, maybe an electrical fault, maybe a strange atmospheric anomaly. But when you piece it all together, none of the math works out. I don't know what was lurking outside that house. I don't know what generated that terrifying sound. And I don't know why reality itself seemed to pause for those agonizing minutes. I've never felt fully comfortable sharing this. Not because I care if people believe me, but because I was there, and a part of me still struggles to accept it. Some of the most unsettling experiences happen when you are at your lowest and most isolated. A few years back, I went through a nasty breakup that completely upended my life. Unable to stay in the home we had shared, I needed a fresh start. My parents offered me the use of their empty lakeside cabin for a while. It was early spring, meaning the surrounding properties were entirely vacant, the trees were bare, and the nights were freezing cold. I packed up my belongings, brought along my dog Milo, and settled in. To my surprise, I actually enjoyed the solitude. I worked remotely during the day and spent my evenings watching television, enjoying the quiet stillness of the lake. For the first couple of weeks, everything was peaceful. But then Milo started acting strange. One evening, I opened the back door to let him out into the yard. Usually he would bolt straight through, but that night, he froze several feet from the threshold. He stared intently into the pitch-black darkness, letting out a low, uneasy whine. Assuming he had spotted a raccoon or a stray animal, I stepped out onto the porch and called his name. That was when I noticed the sky. High above the far side of the lake, several bright points of light were floating. At first, I mistook them for distant stars, until one of them suddenly glided sideways across the horizon, stopped dead, and snapped in a completely different direction. Within seconds, multiple glowing spheres were darting above the water. They did not move like drones or airplanes. They accelerated upward, drifted laterally, and stopped instantaneously without any deceleration. After several agonizing minutes of watching them perform these impossible maneuvers, every single light shot straight up into the atmosphere and vanished. The second they disappeared, Milo trotted outside as if nothing had ever been wrong. The next morning, I called my father, who had spent decades living around that lake. When I described what I saw, he admitted he had never witnessed anything like it in his entire life. I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation, but that evening, my doubts vanished. At almost the exact same hour, Milo began whining anxiously at the back door once more. Dread washed over me as I looked through the glass. The lights were back, but this time, they were much closer, hovering just above the surface of the water. As I watched in utter disbelief, several of the glowing spheres slowly drifted toward one another, merging into a single massive orb of light. It hovered ominously over the dark water for a few brief moments before dropping down below the distant tree line and vanishing out of sight. I barely slept a wink that night. The next day, I spent hours scouring the internet for reports of military drones, atmospheric phenomena, or satellite tests, but nothing matched the impossible movements I had witnessed. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and drive back to the city, but curiosity won out. I needed to know if they would return a third time. Sure enough, right on schedule, the sky filled with light once again. But their behavior was completely different now. They were no longer moving at random. They were advancing in a structured, deliberate formation, inching closer and closer to the cabin. Standing behind the glass door, a faint, low electrical hum began to vibrate through the air, sounding like a buzzing fluorescent bulb. Horror set in as two of the lights broke formation and charged directly toward the house. I grabbed Milo, dropped to the hardwood floor, and covered my head, bracing for a devastating collision. Instead of an impact, complete silence fell over the property. I slowly peeked upward to find the yard entirely empty and still. There were no scorch marks, no broken branches, and no physical evidence that anything had ever been there. In the years since, my friends have tried to brush it off as distant aircraft or a sleep-deprived hallucination. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know Milo reacted to those entities long before they ever became visible in the night sky. I kept this story to myself for years because I knew how ridiculous it would sound. Even now, I sometimes question my own memory, but I know what I saw. It happened during a family road trip almost a decade ago. My wife Laura, our two kids, and I were traveling the country in an old motorhome. We did not have a strict itinerary. We would just drive until we found an interesting spot, stay a few nights, and move on. One campground ended up becoming an unexpected long stay. Our son made friends with another boy there, and they begged us to stick around. The campground was massive. There was a main hub with picnic tables, but the individual sites were spread far apart in a dense wilderness, surrounded by mountains, fields, and a river. It was beautiful, but after sunset, it was pitch black. At the time, I was secretly smoking. I had told my family I quit, but I had not. Every night around 11 p.m., after everyone fell asleep, I would quietly slip out of the motorhome and walk into the woods to light up. I found a secluded overlook about 15 minutes from our site. It became my private spot. One night, as I sat there alone around 11:30 p.m., I heard a deep, rhythmic, pulsing sound. It sounded like someone humming and changing pitch over and over. It was not an animal, not machinery, and definitely not something natural to those woods. Curiosity got the better of me. Instead of heading back, I walked deeper into the trees toward the noise. The closer I got, the louder it vibrated through the air. Then, without warning, it abruptly cut off. I froze. That was when I realized the entire forest had gone dead silent. No insects, no wind, no leaves rustling. It felt like someone had turned the volume down on the entire world. Then a subtle rustle came from behind me. I turned around. Standing about 10 feet away between two trees was a massive, impossibly thin figure. It was far taller than any human. Dark shadows hid most of its face, but I could tell it was staring right at me. Neither of us moved. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. I shifted my weight forward slightly, and the entity instantly jerked backward in response. It was not a shadow. It was reacting to my movements. I took another tiny step. It moved again. Now I could make out its unnaturally long arms, narrow torso, oversized head, and two faint points of light reflecting where its eyes should be. I suddenly felt terrifyingly vulnerable. We stayed locked in that silent confrontation for what felt like forever. Then the figure crouched low as if preparing to lunge. I tensed up to run, but instead of charging, it released a short, sharp, mechanical noise. In a fraction of a second, it jerked sideways and disappeared into the dense trees with terrifying speed. I stumbled backward, barely able to breathe. When I cautiously approached the spot where it had stood, there were no tracks, no broken branches, and no sign of life. Slowly, the ambient sounds of the forest returned to normal, but I was thoroughly rattled. When I finally got back to the motorhome around 3 a.m., my wife was waiting outside, furious. She told me I had been gone for hours. I laughed, thinking she was exaggerating, until she pointed at the clock showing 3:15 a.m. Multiple hours had vanished. and I had zero memory of where that time went. I told her everything. She could see the sheer terror in my face and knew I was not joking. I stayed awake all night, staring out the window toward the tree line. Right around 5 a.m., a powerful rushing sound tore through the air directly above our motorhome, like a massive object sweeping past at high speed. When I ran outside, the sky was completely clear. We packed up and left first thing that morning. Over the years, I have heard other people share similar stories about tall figures, missing time, and strange forest dead zones. I do not know if it was an unknown creature, something unearthly, or a phenomenon beyond our understanding. All I know for sure is that something was watching me in those woods, and those reflecting eyes still haunt me to this day.